The Mafia is a basic part of American life, deny it or not. Every generation has had its underworld kings. Unforgettable personalities that commit unspeakable crimes. The Mafia. It's a name that speaks fear, representing the fascinating, appalling underside of our national experience.
What did you say about all the accusations? What did you think about it?
Often they've been glorified. We call them names like Al Scarface Capone, Lucky Luciano, or the Dapper Don. Many meet their fates in undignified ways. It's not surprising. They're playing a high-stakes game. The Mafia is a business. It turns over more money than America's 10 largest industrial corporations. How did they get this big? Who runs the show? To understand, one has to go back to a quieter, more peaceful time. Back at the turn of the century, America was still a largely white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. But the face of America was changing dramatically. The new wave of immigrants jostled the sense of stability of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, known as WASPs. Many cities became clusters of ethnic neighborhoods, populated by the Irish, the Jewish, the Italians, and others. Most immigrants arrived in the U.S. with very little money. They lived in poverty in city slums, and their lifestyles seemed improper to some WASPs. Local crime was on the increase. Street thefts, prostitution, gambling, and burglaries. And crime was also becoming more violent.
Well, it's been said in the defense of ethnic groups that feel slighted by their association with crime, particularly the Italians, that crime is not an ethnic phenomenon, which it certainly isn't. It certainly goes across all ethnic groups. But one must understand that extreme criminality is often found among groups which are, let's say, the hungriest when they arrive.
There was also another side to it. Many immigrants brought with them a hostile attitude toward the law. The Irish had been oppressed by the British, and for them opposition to British law was heroic. The Italians from southern Italy felt that the law was unjust, and the Jews fled Eastern Europe because they'd been persecuted and denied the right to own property. So for many, getting around the law was an honored activity. The WASPs feared the changes they were seeing. They wanted to establish more control. They were particularly worried about the drinking habits of the new immigrants. The Anti-Saloon League and other temperance movements were already making their opinions known. On January 16th, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution became federal law. Enforced by the Volstead Act, it banned liquor sales, production, and consumption. Most just called it Prohibition.
Prohibition was foisted on this country by white Protestants who were worried about the new immigrant groups, worried about social control, and they saw the abolition of the liquor traffic as a way of imposing a kind of social control on these new immigrant groups.
However, many Americans did not want to stop drinking. They'd suffered through World War I, and they wanted to have some fun. A strong demand was created that needed someone to supply it. For many immigrants who were looking for ways to make money, Prohibition was a dream come true. An illegal but highly profitable career as a bootlegger proved irresistible. The Irish were the first bootleggers. In many cities, they were the saloon keepers and bar owners, and they had close ties to the police and to the politicians. Very soon, however, the Irish met fierce competition.
Then when you come down to bootlegging, of course, this would be at precisely the time that the young Italians and the young Jews raised in American slums would be coming to manhood. And there was an opportunity to move quickly into an expanding business activity.
Most newly arrived Americans played the game straight, committed no crimes, and rose by their own legitimate efforts. Gangsters decided to steal and kill not because they were Irish, Jewish, or Italian, but because they were criminals. Ironically for the WASPs, however, criminal circumstances actually worsened as a result of Prohibition.
No one could predict what would happen with Prohibition. People expected it to work. It's an example of the inscrutability of history. Often consequences are unintended, and Prohibition is a classic example of it. No one thought that it would produce an organized crime institution like it did.
The WASPs believed they could use Prohibition to control the recent immigrants. What they didn't know was that a new, defiant attitude toward American justice was taking root. Some Italians believed more in the Mafia code than in any United States law. And soon, Italian criminals would begin to dominate the other ethnic gangs. But as we'll see, the 1920s were still a time when all the gangs needed each other. Bootleggers connected coast to coast, moving booze. The underworld was becoming coordinated, and organized crime, the Mafia, was born. In turn, the Mafia helped organize American justice. The onset of Prohibition proved an enormous business opportunity for the underworld. What it really spawned were the criminal gangs that we know today. With the passage of the Volstead Acts, modern organized crime came together and developed its web-like structure. It was like an event waiting to happen. Many of the early bootleggers had been involved in the newspaper wars. Major newspapers hired gangs of thugs to force news dealers to carry their paper and not the opposition's. It was a natural graduation into the Prohibition liquor trade, where making money and violence went hand in hand. The most violent and the most successful bootlegger in New York was the Irishman Oney Madden, a convicted murderer and gang leader. When illegal bars or speakeasies opened all over New York, many of them served Madden's beer, a brew called Madden's No. 1. Like other successful bootleggers during this time, Madden went from being a nasty small-time killer to running a major underworld business empire.
Oney Madden of New York was a stone killer. He ran that town. Ed Sullivan, who was a Broadway columnist in the 1920s, said that knowing Oney Madden in the 20s was like knowing the mayor.
The story was the same in Boston, a city with a strong Irish community and a history of resistance to Prohibition. Most of the bootleggers had names that we've forgotten today, with one notable exception, Joseph P. Kennedy, the founder of the Kennedy dynasty. During Prohibition, he was already a bank president and making money on the stock market.
So many of the Boston Irish were involved in bootlegging in the 1920s, and I think perhaps Joe did it on one level just to be one of the guys, to have this connection to the old community from which he had sprung and which he had frankly long ago left behind. It's a way of returning to his ethnic roots in East Boston to become a bootlegger.
I think Joe Kennedy did have a natural affinity with other people who saw themselves as fighting the establishment. I don't think there's any doubt that Joseph Kennedy was in contact with a number of Mafia characters during the 1920s.
Kennedy kept quiet about his underworld associates, although he would maintain contacts with organized crime figures all his life. His public associates were more refined. When the Harvard class of 1912 had its 10th alumni gathering, Joe played a critical role in making it a roaring success.
And Ralph Lowell of the Boston Lowells, who was the secretary of the class of 1912, later described Joe as our decennial Santa Claus, the man who had provided the booze. Joe's operatives brought the booze ashore in Plymouth just as the Pilgrims had come ashore in 1620, and it was great stuff. The Harvard reunion in 1922 was very grateful for this high-class booze provided by Joe Kennedy to the class.
Most of his bootlegging activities weren't so altruistic. Bootlegging was a business for Joe, and it helped him launch the Kennedy fortune. It was, of course, also illegal, and the federal government was doing its best to stop the bootleggers. It was a difficult task. Many people didn't respect the law, and their determination to keep drinking demonstrated that creativity was alive and well in the 1920s America. Much of the alcohol came across the Canadian border. Much of it came from another famous family, the Bronfmans of Canada. Sam Bronfman used the Prohibition trade to build the Seagram's empire, which he ran from an office in Montreal.
The Bronfman group were able to set up transshipping companies in the West Indies and even in Mexico, so that what they really did was to set up a transportation system all the way around the United States. West Coast, East Coast, West Indies, and so on.
All of this took sophisticated organization, and it was a major reason why Prohibition eventually led to the creation of organized crime. Moving large amounts of liquor around was quite different from robbing banks or petty extortion. You had to ship the liquor. You had to get it past the Coast Guard. You had to store it in warehouses and sell it to customers. This was big business, and it became the business of organized crime. One of the main masterminds was Arnold Rothstein, who was aptly called the Brain.
Rothstein is significant because his complete, I can only say, intellectual involvement as the Brain marked the emergence of organized crime as a complete business entity. The further elaboration of the syndicate along business lines is generally due to him.
Arnold Rothstein didn't have a gang as most bootleggers did. He was the money man, fronting money for various enterprises, and then being owed money. Rothstein came from a comfortable Orthodox Jewish family on the Upper West Side of New York. He was an inveterate gambler, and legend has it that the notorious 1919 World Series was fixed by Rothstein. It's the greatest scandal in the history of American baseball. 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were bribed to throw the series to the Cincinnati Reds. But it's one fix that Rothstein didn't do. He just heard about the tampering and made a fortune betting on the right side. Rothstein has a pupil, the young Meyer Lansky. Lansky will eventually take over from Rothstein as the mastermind behind the Mafia. Lansky is one of the contacts between the bootleggers in New York and Seagram's Liquor in Montreal. He's one of the ways that the Bronfmans moved their booze into the United States. Much of the booze came from Canada or Europe, and one of the most important stepping-off points for this flow of alcohol was a small island about 20 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The island of St. Pierre, a vestige of the French Empire, was outside the legal jurisdictions of both the United States and Canada. It proved enormously useful to bootleggers like Rothstein and Lansky.
Legal booze would come into St. Pierre from Canada and Europe, be offloaded there, and get fraudulent papers for shipment somewhere else. So the legal manufacturers could say, we just sent it to St. Pierre, we don't know what happened to it after that.
The liquor would then make its way to the U.S. coasts, where the large ships would anchor 3 to 5 miles offshore, outside U.S. coastal limits.
So every summer you would have what were called motherships off the coast of anywhere from Boston to South Jersey, and small ships would go out and take the booze off. It was so common, of course, that you could go to New York and tourist ships would take you out, and you could watch the bootleggers at work.
The Coast Guard would send high-speed boats out to try and intercept the bootleggers. But sometimes the corruption of Prohibition reached them, too. Once, Oni Madden's partner bribed a Coast Guard cutter to bring in 700 cases of booze to a Manhattan dock. For the bootlegger who got his shipment ashore, the challenges weren't over. Anybody who wanted to hijack his booze could do so. It was frequently known where the booze was going. even what truck it was on. And this in turn meant that rival bootleggers had to hire gunmen to protect their trucks, which proved yet another step in fostering the armed mobsters who would control organized crime. Prohibition had been meant to herald an era of sobriety and clean living. Instead, it was the dawn of unprecedented violence in American life. Gangsters were becoming a way of life. And few cities would prove to be more tainted, more corrupt, and more violent than the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. It was a town where the politicians were bootleggers, the cops were criminals, and the good times rolled. Philadelphia, in the 1920s, America's second largest city. The rivers ran murky in this town. February 1927, the city witnessed its first machine gun slaying, a murder worthy of the movies. That night's evening bulletin used a photo diagram to show how it happened. Racket chieftain Mickey Duffy was the target. Badly wounded, he escaped with his life. His bodyguard died. So what was going on in this city of brotherly love, Philadelphia? This was one of America's oldest, most respected cities. It called itself the workshop of the world and led the nation in producing locomotives, streetcars, textiles, and even hats. It was a proud place, with a blue blood upper class that lived on historic Chestnut Hill and along the so-called Main Line. But there was another side to Philadelphia, less proper, more seamy. Philadelphia didn't just lead the nation in industrial production. It was a leader in corruption. It was a one-party town. The Republican machine had run the city since the 1870s. The politicians ran a protection racket, being paid off by the gambling houses, the prostitutes, and the saloon keepers. Philadelphia's best-known mobster was Boo Boo Hoff. He had grown up in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood in South Philadelphia.
Boo Boo Hoff, who was the most important bootlegger in Philadelphia, was a relatively small man. Looked really very much like any small businessman. That is, nobody would have mistaken him for a criminal, or certainly for a guy who may have been behind violence.
He didn't look much like a gangster, had no reputation himself for violence, although obviously his bootlegging operations involved occasional killings and beatings. Any major bootlegging operation necessarily had to include such things.
Boo Boo Hoff had an office in a downtown bank building. It was here that he ran his unique blend of legal and illegal enterprises.
He had good ties with some of the top police officers, probably in part not so much through his bootleggings as through a shared interest in boxing. I mean, this was a guy who owned boxers, who was part of the sporting world of Philadelphia, and would have gotten to know lots of politicians and policemen at fights.
It's a crooked enterprise in large measure in those days. There are many fixed fights, there are many fixed odds, bets are often smelly. It's a natural place for the gangsters, and it also gives them a cover. If they're in another city away from their base to have a meeting with a gangster, they can say they're just there for a boxing match. And obviously there's a connection between the violence of boxing and the violence of the underworld. The gangsters of all people were not going to object to the violence of boxing. They liked it. It's blood. It's something they're used to and comfortable with. It's a natural place for them.
Boo Boo Hoff used his political connections to move into a number of profitable areas. With the onset of Prohibition, he turned his attention to Philadelphia's massive industrial alcohol industry, to companies like Publickers and Quaker Industrial Alcohol.
What they're doing then is redistilling the alcohol to make it palatable, consumable in beverages. Unfortunately, they typically don't do a very good job of this. And the city coroner reports that 10 to 12 people a week are dying from alcohol poisoning. And it's probably an undercounting because, of course, if Dad has died from tainted gin, his family doesn't want the neighbors or the minister to find out about it.
wonderful to have a good drink of this before lunchtime?
Only part of Philadelphia's alcohol was doctored. Most of the rest arrived via Europe and Canada. Sometimes it came straight up the Delaware through the docks, and sometimes, just sometimes, the Coast Guard caught the bootleggers. But more often than not, Philadelphia's booze made its way in via Rum Row. Philadelphia's bootleggers had a perfect area for smuggling, among the vast stretches of tidal salt marshes on the Delaware Bay. There were few people there, just isolated fishing and farming families.
So the mobsters from Philadelphia would go down to South Jersey, and they would hire, particularly after the Depression hit, they would hire these oystermen, fishermen who couldn't make a living anymore at their trades, and stick them on a powerboat. They'd run out to the ships, waiting ships from Canada or whatever. They'd fill it, the rum-running boat with booze, often in steel cases in case they had to dump it if a revenue or cutter came along and pick it up later. And then they'd run the stuff into these isolated rivers, creeks, and inlets along the bay and the Delaware estuary. The farmers then warehoused the stuff, and it could stay there for a week, a day, or months. And it became a very important part of the local economy.
The mobsters didn't just hand over the drink to their clients. They wanted a bigger piece of the action. They moved into entertainment.
There's a natural connection between the bootleggers and the nightclubs because where do the nightclubs get their liquor? Obviously from the bootleggers. So the bootleggers become partners with many of the people running the nightclubs at that time, and ultimately they own many of the clubs.
Boo Boo Hoff ran the Turf Club in the Sylvania Hotel and several other clubs, which attracted the city's upper class. At the speakeasies, the elite could rub elbows with the underworld.
The speakeasy was the daring-in place to go. Anybody who was anybody wanted to be seen in these kinds of places. You had to have a business card to get in. You had to know the owner. There was a daringness to it. There was a bravado. In a sense, it was kind of a voyeuristic thrill. You were doing something daring. You were tweaking the nose of Uncle Sam while at the same time experiencing a great new art form in jazz, socializing with the highbrows of society and the literati and the Gold Coast mavens. It was a wonderful time to be alive.
Now here's a very entrancing phrase. It will put you in a daze. But to me it don't mean a thing, 'cause it's got a very peculiar swing.
Many of America's most famous musicians played in the speakeasies, also rubbing elbows with mobsters.
There was a certain affinity between the gangsters and the jazzmen. They have a certain common ground, nocturnal habits, a style of dressing, disapproval by the straight world, things to hide, glamorous women, secrets. They understood each other in interesting ways at a time when blacks and whites had very little contact as social peers.
There was no question who ran the show. Take New York's Cotton Club, one of the fanciest nightclubs in the country. Its ownership was concealed, but the boss was Owney Madden. Owney Madden wants the best entertainers. He wants Duke Ellington, and he's distressed when in 1927, the Duke goes to play at Philadelphia's Standard Theater.
So Owney Madden calls down to his buddy in Philadelphia, Maxie Boo Boo Hoff, and Boo Boo Hoff sends his associate, Charlie Yankee Schwartz, over to the manager of the Standard, who delivers his famous line, "Be big or be dead." And Ellington and the orchestra pack up their bags, head back to New York, and begin their famous engagement at the Cotton Club.
Thereafter, anytime Ellington wants to take his band on the road, he has to pay Cab Calloway's band to take his place at the Cotton Club. The connection is that tight. Essentially, Madden owns Ellington's band in those years.
In Philadelphia, the sound of music was turning ugly, and the bell began to ring for reforms. When the city elected a new mayor, Freeling Kendrick, he asked President Coolidge to send someone to clean up the city. Marine Brigadier General Smedley Darlington Butler arrived and started a determined campaign to stomp out crime and enforce prohibition. Butler discovered that nearly everyone was on the take: the police, the politicians, and the mobsters.
Butler becomes increasingly frustrated. He goes public with his frustrations. He gets in arguments with the mayor. And finally, before leaving after the end of his second year, in a speech before a group of women in Pittsburgh, he calls Philadelphia a cesspool on the edge of the state, and says that Philadelphia simply lacks the will or resolve to enforce prohibition.
Philadelphians are upset about the situation. So in 1928, Judge Edwin Lewis convenes a grand jury to look into the matter. He takes lots of evidence from lots of witnesses, and the story is grisly. The extent of the graft, he estimates that about $2 million a year is being paid to Philadelphia cops and politicians by the bootleggers.
In August 1928, the jury announced its findings. It was a damning indictment of the Philadelphia police. They had discovered 24 high-ranking officers with bank accounts worth about $750,000. Not bad when the average policeman's salary was only about $2,000 a year. The policemen came up with some weak excuses. Some said they had been lucky in crap games. Others that they had bet on the right horse. In the end, 138 policemen were found unfit for service.
Boo Boo Hoff, the grand jury's final statement, says he's probably behind all of this, but we can't indict him. He's too insulated by fronts and covers. And so the grand jury really amounted to not very much. Some interesting information, but no arrests. No prosecutions came from it. They could not touch Boo Boo Hoff.
Boo Boo Hoff survived Prohibition without going to jail. But there were crime fighters who refused to give up. And one was an extraordinary young woman, at the time a rare figure in American justice.
Alcohol is hindering the coming of world peace because it is befuddling the thinking of humanity. It is no laughing matter today when the National Survey of Education on Alcoholism states that one out of every 6 boozers are women.
It was the women's movement, the suffragettes, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the powerful Anti-Saloon League that had been the driving force behind Prohibition. So it was logical, if somewhat radical, for a woman, Mabel Walker Willebrandt, to be asked to enforce the new law.
A woman was very important to be in that position because Prohibition was looked at as a woman's issue. Women had just gotten the vote. So it was a high visibility position. It was a moral crusade to many people.
Mabel Walker Willebrandt was an unusual woman. She was born in Kansas, began school at 13, was a principal by 22, a lawyer at 27, and was just 32 when President Harding appointed her Assistant Attorney General in 1921. She became the enemy of the bootleggers and of what would become organized crime.
For all of my life, I've had the most uncanny feeling that always seems to say to me, you are marked to step into a crisis sometime as the instrument of God. It seems that it may mean danger or disgrace or in some way cause me agony of heart, but I can't escape it. With recurring frequency, I've had the feeling so often all my life, since I was a very little girl. Lately, I've quit fighting it.
Apparently, trying to enforce Prohibition was that special mission that God had in mind for her. That gave her the strength she needed to persist, but it also gave her a kind of fanatical edge.
Willebrandt believed in upholding the law of Prohibition. She had wine, certainly before, or whiskey sours before she came into office. She didn't drink at all while she was in office, and she worked fiercely and was viewed as a zealot to enforce the law.
It's often said that drinking actually went up during Prohibition, but that wasn't the case. The only thing that went up was the price. Name brand whiskey, for instance, went from $0.10 a shot to as much as $3. People may have just thought there was more drinking because it was more daring, more celebrated, more extreme. One drink's recipe from the time captured the atmosphere.
Take 3 chorus girls and 3 men. Soak in champagne till midnight. Squeeze into an automobile. Add a drunken chauffeur and a dash of joy. Shake well. Serve at 70 miles an hour. Chaser, a coroner's inquest.
The saloon had been replaced by speakeasies, some of which lived up to their Hollywood image of secret peepholes, breathless passwords, and fantastic decor. Many of the best-known people in society visited the speakeasies.
So you have millions of lawbreakers, perfectly law-abiding citizens otherwise, who now are breaking a federal law by drinking. And so the line becomes blurred, and organized crime is much more intertwined in American life because of Prohibition in a way that it had not before then.
She kept saying that the upper class, the Kennedys of this world, had a particular responsibility. She felt that was very important, and she pressed that. And said there seemed to be sometimes just then the working class that was out there made prey of the bootleggers.
But she found herself with few true allies in the Justice Department.
She was surrounded by older, skeptical men who were doubtful about the whole enterprise. She got very little cooperation from the attorneys general. Harry Daugherty, for example, Harding's notoriously crooked attorney general, gave her no cooperation.
The Justice Department made a great song and dance about clamping down on bootleggers, calling in the newsreel cameramen to show their dramatic raids to the public.
When I was appointed to this office, I stated publicly and promised myself that we would enforce the national prohibition policies honestly and earnestly and lawfully. I do not like spectacular methods or anything that may be described as a drive. Steady, relentless pressure, intelligently applied to the maximum of our resources at all times and in all seasons is our aim and intention.
The truth was that the feds frequently turned a blind eye. The Prohibition Bureau agents were poorly paid and easily bribed. 1 in 12 was dismissed for corruption, and many quit to become bootleggers. But Willebrandt refused to give up. She began a campaign in Florida, where much of the booze was coming in via the Bahamas and Cuba. Willebrandt was determined to clamp down.
The most dramatic was in Florida, where she really got all of the government agencies, the Navy, which sent down 11 destroyers, the Coast Guard, you had 30 vessels, 2 airplanes, and in a gigantic attack, you really had them make tremendous raids.
It was something of a personal triumph for Willebrandt, but when she turned her attention to padlocking New York's speakeasies, she stirred up criticism.
People did call foul because they thought it was a little unfortunate that you were having all of these raids, and the raids were highly publicized because there were so many of them, plus which the U.S. attorney obviously was not agreeing with Mabel and was giving out adverse stories that there was a sort of Roman holiday going on there. But great was flapdoodle. She just blew it off and said, this is something we've been doing. And in her annual report that year, she pointed out that 7,000 padlocks injunctions had been actually instituted that year. And she was pleased because after the headlines went, they'd taken 18 to court and they'd found guilty 15 of them.
But Willebrandt was getting worn down by the constant struggle.
Mabel's great frustration was you always got the little fish. It was very hard to get the big fish, and she wanted the big fish. She had a cartoon that she kept which showed her with a mop trying to mop it up and keep it back, the incoming waves. And it was obvious that there was this inundation coming. When she left office in 1929, she wrote to her parents that she felt very often like the little boy who put his arm in the dike. And so she'd stopped a lot of things, she said, but it's a wearing way to be a hero.
Years later, a judge said of Willebrandt, if Mabel had worn trousers, she would have been president. But despite her good work, some of the worst criminals in American history were beginning to emerge. The most important legacy of Prohibition was the creation of organized crime. But it wasn't the Irish gang nor the Jewish mob that would ultimately rule. It was the Cosa Nostra, better known as the Italian Mafia.
The Italians had the Mafia. No one else had that secret criminal brotherhood, and that gives the Italians an extraordinary cohesiveness and a kind of national organization that the Irish and Jewish gangs did not have.
From the quiet, dark alleys of Little Italy to the flamboyance of Al Capone, the Italian criminals have survived and flourished like no others. But to understand their dominance in the underworld, one must go back. After World War I, powerful Irish gangs controlled the lucrative Brooklyn waterfront, collecting tribute, about $1,500 a week, from each of the more than 60 dock owners. Those who declined saw their wharves and vessels looted, burned, or wrecked, or worse.
The East Coast Longshoremen has been a mobbed-up union for most of this century. It started even before Prohibition, originally with Irish guys on the Brooklyn docks. It was a very dangerous occupation to be head of the Longshoremen's Union on the Brooklyn docks because you had a short life expectancy. 6 or 8 guys in a single decade would take this job, be killed off, someone else would get the job, be killed off.
The Brooklyn Bridge area was traditionally Irish territory.
The White Hand Gang, or shall we say the Irish Mafia, they were an underworld superpower. They had control, literal control over 60 piers in operation in Brooklyn at the time. It was a gold mine.
But the White Hand would soon meet their match. The Italian gangs, known as the Black Hand, wanted the riches for themselves. From 1920 to 1925, a grim war raged along the waterfront for control of the lush extortion rackets. For a time, the leader of the White Hand, Wild Bill Lovett, held off the Italian Black Hand.
While Bill Lovett was the most spectacular gang leader the White Hand ever had. On the waterfront, everybody knew that this man will, soon as look at you, blow your head off. The man was a very dangerous man, really.
No less fearless was the Italian leader of the Black Hand, Frankie Yale. He retained an iron-fisted control over his men.
Frankie Yale was the first celebrity godfather. No question about it.
Yale was the first of the openly flamboyant gangsters. He was known as the Prince of Pals. He was an extremely popular person, not least for the fact that he liked to cultivate a sort of Robin Hood image of taking from the rich and giving to the poor.
For instance, during the coal strike of 1922, Yale's men delivered coal to hundreds of families who were freezing. This was the paradox about Frankie Yale. He was vicious, and yet he was also sympathetic.
The reason for Frankie Yale's generosity, in my personal opinion, was he was born into abject poverty. He knew what it was to be poor. And he had, his heart went out for the poor people.
But still, the bloody feud went on, and Yale needed tough henchmen.
He was introduced to Alphonse Capone at a very young age, and he took a liking to Al. He tutored Al in the ABCs of the underworld.
Yale put Capone to work as a bartender and a bouncer in his dance club. From his humble beginnings in Brooklyn, Al Capone would carry a nickname for the rest of his life: Scarface. One night while Capone was working, he told a female customer, "You got a beautiful ass." Her brother, Frank Galluccio, took out his knife, aimed for Capone's throat, but instead slashed his face 3 times. Gangsters lived dangerously, and before long, Capone savagely beat up a member of the White Hand Gang. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, came looking for him.
Frankie Yale got word that Wild Bill Lovett was trying to track down Capone. He says, Al, look, the best thing I could tell you, this man is going to, sooner or later, with the scars and off identification, he's gonna get you sooner or later.
So Frankie Yale sent Al Capone to work with Johnny Torrio in Chicago. It proved a lucky move. When Prohibition began, Frankie Yale mobilized his Black Hand troops into bootlegging, using his links in Chicago.
What Prohibition did was it took rather loosely organized neighborhood gangs and it put them into transnational communication with each other. Because what was involved was the shipping of various liquors from one part of the country to another, even from outside the country, it was of enormous benefit towards making this a sort of national combination.
The White Hand's power was waning. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, was gruesomely murdered by the Black Hand. When Richard Pegleg Lonergan took over, Al Capone returned to Brooklyn to get rid of this Irish gang once and for all.
Sylvester Agulia was the man chosen to start the ball in motion. He was to whack a top lieutenant of the Irish White Hand Gang across the head with a meat cleaver. That was the signal. The lights went out and the gunfire erupted immediately. The outcome was the murder, a triple gangland murder, as a matter of fact. Al Capone had finally murdered a man, Richard Lonergan. It turned out to be the most important murder of his whole career. His reputation throughout the Italian underworld nationally really zoomed, because what he actually did was hand over the entire Brooklyn waterfront to the Italian underworld. And after, very soon after, the White Hand Gang evaporated into nothing at all, just died out.
Now Frankie Yale controlled the New York waterfront and was Al Capone's chief liquor supplier. Capone quickly became Chicago's crime boss. It was the beginning of the rise of the Italian Mafia. The Prohibition era created many underworld criminals, but ultimately, the Italians would reign supreme. In the years to come, the Italian Mafia would take aim at many other targets, but in turn, they would be the secret ceremony where somber men become mafiosi, vowing to live and die by the knife and the gun. A mysterious world of shifting alliances and blood oaths, reminders in the flames that they are doomed if they break the code of Omerta, the vow of silence. They are the only secret criminal brotherhood, the Mafia. Only an Italian can belong. It is the key to their takeover of organized crime. But ultimately, it all comes down to murder and money. The Mafia controls by fear, a fear that has its roots in the parched soil of Sicily. The Mafia flourished in Sicily during the century of political upheaval and disorder between Napoleon and Mussolini. Economic conditions were grim, brought on by the Italian government's total neglect of this island.
During that 100 years, there wasn't much real government in Sicily. And so the Mafia arises as a mediator between the citizens on the ground in Sicily and the distant governments that were out of reach, beyond reach, and corrupt. The Sicilians were pretty much kicked around in those days. And so there was a tradition of seeing the law as distant and unfriendly and beyond reach. The saying was, the law works against people.
So respected local men took control, creating their own rules. The poor turned to these men because they stood up to the government and met the needs of their village. These local men became the functioning government of a village. It was the local don who drew up contracts, arranged marriages, loaned money, mediated disputes, and chose police chiefs and judges. Young Salvatore Lucchini, later known as Lucky Luciano, was accustomed to seeing men of respect in their expensive suits walking the piazza, receiving the homage of his neighborhood. By 1880, the men of respect, or Mafia, secretly ruled Sicily. They had infiltrated the local police, the army, and all branches of government. Honest government officials who tried to combat the Mafia were invariably murdered. Lucky's father, Antonio, heard that in America, he could earn more in one day than he could in 1 month in the sulfur mines.
So they come here essentially for economic opportunity, and they try to recreate the old conditions that they knew at home. Here they are in this strange land with its strange mores and strange language. The Mafia is familiar, and it has its own code of honor, a code that is often breached, but still the code is there. For example, that one mafiosi could not mess with the wife of another mafiosi, and if such happened, then the man who had been cuckolded had the right to kill the seducer. Well, that's not allowed in American customs, but it was part of the Mafia code.
The Mafia's a criminal gang. They're a bunch of thugs and murderers, but they are giving their members a sense of stability in the face of this country where everything is progress and change. The underside is that it means they're not assimilated into America, and that sets them up for the Mafia. The Mafia had first surfaced in America in New Orleans, just after the Civil War, amid conditions of political chaos because of Reconstruction. Once again, the Mafia appears because the Italian immigrants need some mediating force between them and the government. And the Mafia steps into that breach while also committing crimes. It's always doing both. 2 Mafia families successfully transplanted themselves from Sicily. Soon they were battling for control of the lucrative shipyards and vegetable markets and were encroaching upon local politics. One Mafia member, Vincenzo Otumbo, was disgruntled at having been cut out of the group's spoils and threatened to go to the authorities. On January 24th, 1889, his throat was slit while playing cards. Police Chief David Hennessy led an investigation. He was the first in the U.S. to learn of the Mafia's existence. He openly criticized Italians, boldly stating he had no use for them. On October 15, 1890, he was shot and killed in front of his house. The press screamed for vengeance. The police embarked on a wholesale roundup of Italians. On March 14, 1891, a mob of 8,000 people stormed the old parish prison, broke into the jail, shot 9 Italian fishermen in their cells, and hanged 2 more. No one was ever indicted.
But there's no doubt that some of them were involved in organized crime, as was Police Chief Hennessy. He was in the pay of one of the Mafia families that was fighting each other, and so the other family killed him. He was no knight in shining armor.
By 1900, the Mafia was stronger than ever in New Orleans and worked in silence, with members belonging to one powerful family with a boss. The strict family code of the Mafia was kept intact as new chapters were established in other cities. Sicilian immigrants to America brought along the Mafia as a culture, not an organization. The Mafia offered them a sense of order in the new world. But it was also a secret criminal enterprise, threatening immigrants with robbery, extortion, kidnapping, even murder. The blending of Sicilian traditions within a crowded, often hostile American context spawned a particular hybrid, the American Mafia, which we'll see posed a new threat to American justice. The Lucchini family's dreams of America were shattered by the reality of the tenements of New York when they arrived in 1906. At 700 people per acre, the Lower East Side was more crowded than Bombay. These Sicilian immigrants lived on the streets, trying to recreate the piazza they had known back home. Antonio became a day laborer, and the 5 young Lucanias quickly Americanized their names. Giuseppe became Joseph, Francesca, Fanny, Bartolo, Bart, Concetta, Connie, and Salvatore, Charles. They also changed their last name from Lucania to Luciano. Practically any neighborhood where a large population of Sicilian immigrants lived, the Mafia also existed. At the time, the Mafia was also known as the Black Hand, a group that mainly preyed on fellow Italians. Their main line was an extortion racket. They had a fearsome reputation in the neighborhood, but one policeman fought back.
Tenente Giuseppe Petrosino was the first Italian New York City policeman to ever reach the status of a lieutenant. He was doing a very effective job against the Black Hand. Whenever a man came from Italy, a paisan or a friend of his would bring this man to police headquarters, stand in front of the headquarters until he saw Giuseppe Petrosino and point this dreaded enemy of the Black Hand out.
As the Black Handers grew in size and muscle power, they began harassing the most famous Italian of his day, Enrico Caruso.
The Mafia sent him a letter demanding a $10,000 payment within a week, or meet your debt. Not even the dust of your family will remain. Caruso wisely got in touch with Lieutenant Petrosino and showed him the letter, and he was given round-the-clock bodyguards. Now, if Caruso would have yielded to their demands, I mean, there would have been no end to it.
When he performed at the Metropolitan Opera, Petrosino was assigned to protect him. But no such protection was possible for others. When Petrosino investigated the man-in-the-barrel case, it was too late.
A corpse was discovered in a wooden barrel. Some woman was walking to work, and she was Irish, by the way. She saw this lid open, and there was a piece of clothing hanging out. She opened the lid, and she saw this man stuffed into this barrel, and his genitals shoved in his mouth.
Well, Petrosino was an extraordinary individual, mainly because he can be considered to be the founder of the modern Interpol concept. With all these Sicilian criminals who were coming to the United States, he realized that there would have to be some cooperation with the Italian police so that they might be prosecuted or at least removed as undesirable aliens.
In 1909, Petrosino went to Sicily to check out police records. He went through the Italian files and saw many familiar faces from his neighborhood in New York, but his moves were being watched.
On March 12, 1909, he was eating dinner at the Piazza Marina, and he was told to meet parties unknown so many feet around the Garibaldi Garden. And there, 3 men come up to him, pushed him up to a fence, and shot him. It was, to me, it was suicide, really. I don't know why he did it, but he was a very courageous man.
In New York, the Mafia was strengthening its hold, and in the melting pot of the Lower East Side, Lucky Luciano met 3 other young immigrants, an Italian from Calabria named Frank Costello, and 2 Jews, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. An alliance was forged, which would come to dominate organized crime in the United States and change its character forever. The most important hoodlum of his time was a young Italian named Frankie Yale. He was more than just a 2-bit head-cracking gangster and extortionist.
He was the first celebrity godfather. No question about it. He owned a cigar company with his portrait on the box. He was the Beau Brummel of the Brooklyn underworld, and a killer the country over, really.
In New York, as in Sicily, the Mafia ran their local communities, providing services that the government couldn't or wouldn't. Yale was the protector.
His heart went out for the poor people. On holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, he would send his men out with baskets of macaroni, canned goods, turkeys, to feed the poor people in his area.
He set himself up as a dispenser of justice. For instance, common robbery, especially of people who were poor, he would simply not tolerate it.
One of Yale's prodigies was forever proud that he was born in the United States, not Naples. He Americanized his name from Alphonse Capone to Al Capone and modeled himself after his mentor, Frankie Yale.
He tutored Al in the ABCs of the underworld. He put Al to work as a bartender and a greeter at the Harvard Inn. It was a dine and dance joint on the Coney Island waterfront. Al showed a lot of potential, really. He was tough. He was a good shot with a gun. With a bat, he was terrific.
But when Capone nearly killed a member of Wild Bill Lovett's White Hand gang, he'd gone too far. By 1919, Capone's violent reputation had spread throughout the Brooklyn docks. He was already a murder suspect in 2 cases. Finally, Frankie Yale decided to send him out to Chicago for his own safety. As we'll see, it was a move that changed the face of organized crime forever. Chicago was never innocent. The city swarmed with pimps and pickpockets, operating in and out of brothels, saloons, and dives of every description. For Chicago's gangsters, the beginning of Prohibition in 1920 was an answered prayer, especially for young Al Capone, who was now under the tutelage of Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio was noted for his intelligence rather than his muscle. From the first, Capone reserved his loyalty for Torrio, and Torrio's views automatically became Capone's.
Torrio saw the potential in this man. He was big. He was willing to do what was necessary, meaning to harm somebody, a hit. And he was smart. But before they went into bootlegging, Big Jim Colosimo, Torrio's uncle, refused to invest 1 dime in the bootlegging business. He says, we're doing okay with our houses of prostitution, our gambling. What do we need bootleg booze for? I don't want to tangle with no feds.
Jim Colosimo, the last of the Mustache Petes of Chicago, an old-time crime boss who by 1920, even though he'd only been around 20 or 25 years in the city, was very much out of step with his young contemporaries who were on their way up.
Well, there was only one thing to do. The guy's got to be hit. Uncle or no uncle, the man has to be hit. I mean, here's a business, we can make millions in this bootleg booze.
Big Jim was gunned down as he was leaving his cafe. A cryptic note read, "So long, vampire, so long, lefty." With Big Jim Colosimo out of the way, Torrio and Capone expanded their bootlegging. In 1924, a gangster named Dion O'Banion became troublesome as he started hijacking their liquor.
Dion O'Banion was the boss of the vicious North Side gang. However, O'Banion's demeanor belied what he really was. He was a former choir boy. He ran a flower shop on State Street with his partner Schofield, and he was a gangster of some refinements.
Dion O'Banion became a thorn in Torrio's side. Torrio put in a call to Brooklyn, Frankie Yale, to come out to do a special job. Frankie takes the train out, orders a floral display for Miguel Merlo's funeral on an appointed day. They came in. "You got my flowers?" "Yes." "You from Mike Merlo's?" "Yes." "It's good to see you." Shook hands. Frank held tight while the other 2 torpedoes opened up on him. Shot him dead. Yale was given $10,000 in 1920 dollars we're talking about, and a 4-carat diamond ring.
O'Banion's funeral was a top mob social event. The streets were so jammed, scalpers demanded $1 for vantage points on buildings. The florist was buried in a $10,000 bronze coffin.
With O'Banion out of the way, the Prohibition War of Chicago really escalates in the next few years as one North Side boss after another is gunned down, and retribution follows.
You see, the thing is not to get the assassin. It's to get the guy that pays the assassin. They tried to ambush Capone. Torrio was a victim of the shooting. Decided to pack it in, and he handed over the whole of Chicago as, Al, it's all yours. I'm leaving. He got, he came close to dying, and he handed over the whole works to Capone.
By 1927, Al Capone had become one of Chicago's top media celebrities.
But his reputation has been somewhat inflated because he loves to be interviewed by journalists. He makes himself available to journalists, and he talks on about this and that. He's not very bright. I mean, even for a gangster, Al Capone is pretty stupid. But the journalists take these maunderings, these random reflections of Al Capone, and turn them into sentences and paragraphs. So he's made to seem intelligent.
Al Capone loved to go down the street in his big black limousine with bodyguards surrounding him. He loved to go to ballparks and have the crowd cheer when he entered his box.
Chicago's most notorious citizen, Al Capone, king of the gangsters, appears in a new role, that of public benefactor, when he sets up soup kitchens to feed unemployed.
If it wasn't for our friend Al Capone rotting up in this here White House on 935 South State Street, we wouldn't eat.
But what the Chicago Capone really enjoyed was the Chicago of the nightclubs and its more than 10,000 speakeasies.
There were so many nightclubs that you couldn't wade through them. I played the piano, I sung, I played the musical saw, and I never cared too much for dancing, and I didn't consider myself a flapper. I considered myself a Southern lady.
Rio Burke knew Capone well. She was married to Dominic Roberto, one of his lieutenants.
He was always having him out to the house with a group of men. And they had one long table, and they all sat at the table. The men, women didn't, we stayed in the background. Served them and cooked for them. And
Dominic's line of work became more apparent when Rio's maid found a huge gunny sack in the closet.
It was loaded with all kinds of guns, pistols, sawed-off shotguns, every kind of guns. So we put it back. And when Dominic came home, I said, honey, what are all those guns doing downstairs in that gunny sack? Well, he says, some of the boys are going hunting. They went hunting, all right. And then, of course, I'd hear things. But he wouldn't let me socialize. And the wives did not socialize. If they had business to take care of, they did it somewhere else, in Al's office or a place like that. They would never do it in a place like our house.
Capone always had someone to do his thinking for him. It's Johnny Torrio at first, and then after Torrio retires or is retired and returns to New York in 1926, there's a man named Greasy Thumb Guzik, Jake Guzik, who was a Jewish gangster and is sort of the man who is at Capone's right hand, telling him what to do, how to handle his money, and so on.
Throughout all the vicious years, Capone saw himself as merely providing services for others. I give the people what it wants. I've given people the light pleasures, and all I get is abuse.
He developed contact with the New York mob. He was operating in the city and the suburbs, and one by one, he ruthlessly closed down all of his competitors.
Capone was buying booze from all over the country, doing business with Frankie Yale. A lot of trucks were being hijacked before they even left Brooklyn, so he was suspicious. Capone had a friend in Brooklyn, James Fauzi D'Amato, who he asked to keep an eye on Yale. Fauzi wound up dead. On July 1st, 1928, around 4 p.m., Yale was drinking in his speakeasy. A call came in. Something happened to your wife. Runs out to his car. Suddenly he spots a black Nash trailing him. Speeds up. The other car gained on him. Hey, Frankie! That's it. They hit him. Machine gun, shotgun, and pistol fire. And to make, this is true, to make sure the car came to a screeching halt as Yale's car crashed into a building. One of the gunmen leaped out, drew a .45 automatic, ran up to the fallen Yale, and pumped the whole clip into his head. Frankie Yale, the first celebrity godfather, received the biggest gangland funeral in the nation. There were 250 cars in a procession, plus 38 flower cars, and the casket he rested in was a nickel and silver casket that cost $1928 now we're talking about. 15 grand. There was at least 12 to 15,000 mourners. Alphonse Capone was and is still the most famous gangster of the 20th century. But the thing is, who is the man who started him on his way to becoming what he was, a celebrity gangster? Frankie Yale, who he modeled his life after.
But the bloodiest event was yet to come. When news of the St. Valentine's Day massacre broke in the Chicago press, few people could believe what had happened. It was an event unparalleled in gangland history, and a sad day for American justice. With rival bootleggers eliminated, Al Capone faced a challenge from the lone survivor, George Bugs Moran. In the struggle for control of Chicago's liquor trade, Moran had twice tried to kill Capone and failed. On February 14th, 1929, 7 Moran gangsters were huddled in a cold warehouse, awaiting a shipment of whiskey. According to a housewife next door, a Cadillac pulled up and 4 men went inside, 2 in uniform, leading the way. She assumed it was a police raid. And so did the 7 men inside. They lined up against the wall, expecting to be arrested. The machine gun swung back and forth 3 times, first at the level of their heads, then chests, then stomachs. Over 1,000 bullets shattered their bone and cartilage at point-blank range. A pool of blood formed 40 feet wide. Capone was in Florida at the time, but it's clear his gang did it. It was the most notorious example of bootlegging violence, and it's ultimately the catalyst for Capone's downfall. For the 2 main triggermen of the massacre, Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, there was a cruel reward. Capone assembled a room full of mobsters to honor them for their recent deeds. Capone heard that his guests of honor were part of a conspiracy to dethrone him.
In the course of the dinner, Al Capone takes a baseball bat and beats them to death, hammers away at their heads, and they're killed. The bodies are carted off, and the dinner continues as though nothing happened.
Get these criminals behind prison walls. It's too bad that we even have to pay for their support. Their extermination would be much more satisfactory.
Already these rats are running for cover, and it's the duty of every law-abiding citizen to help hurt them from the hiding place and see that when caught, they are treated for what they really are, rats.
President Hoover responded to the public's outrage. Parallel investigations were launched with Prohibition agent Elliot Ness and the Justice Department searching for bootlegging evidence, and the IRS's Frank Wilson looking for proof of taxable income. He wanted to know why the high-living Capone never filed a tax return. Like Capone, Elliot Ness loved the limelight and guaranteed coverage by telling the press in advance when he planned a raid.
Somebody spilled the beans, and now Prohibition agents are spilling the beer. Thousands of gallons with plenty of kick. There's no doubt about it, the raid is a smashing success. Talk about showers, how'd you like to stand under this one?
The IRS men, Elmer Irie and Frank Wilson, operated in secrecy and obscurity and were able to infiltrate Capone's organization. Although Capone never signed any checks, they uncovered $165,000 worth of taxable income. But Wilson wasn't satisfied. He wanted evidence to put Capone away for good. He needed an informer, but no one was talking.
Omerta is actually the Mafia law of silence. When you become a member of the Mafia, you take an oath that you will, with love and secrecy, you cannot expose the secrets of the organization, okay? I'm sorry, you know, it's absolute and it's enforced.
It should be noted that the very strictness and harshness of the Code of Omerta contains implicit in it the very fact that informing is a possibility.
Artful Eddie O'Hare was a lawyer, one of Capone's lawyers, and he ran racetracks for the Capones. He had a son named Butch on whom he doted, peppered his conversation with references to my son Butch. He wants Butch to be able to go to Annapolis, and he can't because Artful Eddie is a gangster. So as Eddie told the story, he turns against Al Capone, provides evidence for Al Capone's tax case. And so Artful Eddie is sort of pardoned. He becomes a good citizen. The Capones learn about this treachery and kill him. But Eddie O'Hare is indeed a Navy hero during World War II, and O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named for this son of a gangster.
As a last desperate attempt, Capone offered $1.5 million in cash to IRS man Elmer Irie. Irie turned him down.
Mr. Alphonse Capone, alias Mr. Al Brown, alias the Big Shot, has met the enemy and he is theirs. Now for a change, they're taking him for a ride. And so, up until 1940, Mr. Capone will be Mr. 40,886. Let that be a good lesson to you. Always be sure and pay your income tax.
Capone was not put away by Eliot Ness. It was the pencil-pushing intellectuals like Elmer Irie and Frank Wilson who did the tax work against Al Capone. Eliot Ness is a footnote figure.
In 1947, suffering from syphilis, pneumonia, and a brain hemorrhage, 48-year-old Al Capone died. According to Jake Guzik, he was as nutty as a fruitcake.
He had syphilis for a long time, but he never did anything about it. I don't think he believed it. And then, of course, he did die. He lost his mind, you know.
Historians have been unusually kind to Al Capone. Recently, Al Capone was retried and found innocent in a mock trial, I believe, by the American Bar Association. And now in Chicago, they're opening up an Al Capone museum along the Gold Coast.
With Capone toppled through tax evasion and Prohibition on the way out, the speakeasies of the 20s became the nightclubs of the 30s and provided the gangsters with a legal income and a front. When black jazz musicians worked in gangster clubs, it brought together lives on the social outskirts of conventional society. At a time when blacks and whites had little contact as peers, the gangsters and jazzmen shared a communal nature of experience that transcended race.
Well, I suppose the gangsters were as racist as most white people were at the time, but some of them did like jazz. Some of the jazzmen have said, I wish they still owned the nightclubs. You could trust them. If they said they were going to pay you, they paid you. And sometimes they provided services.
There's a story about how one band picked up a singer down south and brought him to Chicago to the major black club, which was of course owned by the Capones. When the man's white employer came up to try and get him back, he was beaten up by the club's bouncers and sent back south. The jazz singer got to stay in Chicago.
And I love to sing, shortened and bread with a hunk of sugar cane in my mouth.
At the time, Joey Lewis was a promising cabaret singer.
Yes, sirree, I'm from this house.
The Green Mill was a jumping speakeasy on the north side, booking the top nightclub acts of the era into there. Joey Lewis was booked into the Green Mill. He received an offer to perform elsewhere while under contract to the syndicate-controlled place. He broke the contract and was viciously slashed in the neck, allegedly by Machine Gun Jack McGurn. Afterwards, all hopes of a singing career were abandoned, and Joey Lewis had to change careers and become a comedian.
I should have a bicarbonate float but I'll have a champagne cocktail instead.
In some cases, the gangsters control the performers, especially if they have gambling habits. Joey Lewis, for example, was an inveterate gambler, often lost, and so he was beholden to the gangsters who ran the gambling games that he frequented. So he was one of their favorite couriers.
Here's Milton Berle, Broadway comedian.
Gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm a little unprepared. I didn't know they were going to call on me till 6 weeks ago.
Milton Berle is a man who started his gambling in the 1930s when his career as an entertainer begins in nightclubs. He later estimates that he lost about $3 million over the years gambling. Again, these connections, the gambling debts, put him into contact with gangsters.
How old are you?
39.
39?
Yes.
Shy 10.
Jimmy Durante is another example. In that case, it's not he that does the gambling, but his manager, Luke Clayton, who is an inveterate gambler, and so Jimmy Durante often appears at gangster clubs. Lena Horne starts her showbiz career as a dancer at the Cotton Club in the early 1930s. Her father is Ted Horne, who is a numbers boss in Pittsburgh. He's a gambling man, a fancy man in the black underworld. And at one point, Lena Horne wanted to leave the chorus line at the Cotton Club and perform somewhere else. And her father was trying to arrange that with the employers at the Cotton Club. They disagreed with him, and to prove their point, they beat him up and shoved his head into a toilet. So Lena Horne stayed at the Cotton Club. She says that she was so young that she was not offered to gangsters, as most of the dancers were in that club. Most of the dancers had certain, shall we say, social responsibilities to favored guests of the club, but she was too young for that.
Baby, I don't want no more loving. No, I'd rather be all alone. So when my payday comes around, I call my money on my own. Let me forget you, baby.
The connections among the mob and show business last for decades. They start in Prohibition because the bootleggers are providing the booze to the nightclubs, but those connections last for a long time. Copacabana Club in New York, for example, is one of the most glamorous nightclubs in the city in the 40s and 50s. It's owned secretly by Frank Costello, and its season in the fall is usually opened by Joey Lewis, the mob's favorite comedian.
But underneath the glittering surface lay a world of seething violence based on money and murder. Capone's Chicago may have been the scene of the most violent and spectacular crimes, but New York City contributed the most significant Italian bootleggers. Significant both for the time and for the future of organized crime. By the mid-1920s, New York gained its most powerful leader to date, a crude, stocky man named Giuseppe Masseria, or Joe the Boss. Joe Bonanno said Joe the Boss attacked a plate of spaghetti as if he were a drooling mastiff. Joe the Boss gathered around him a group of criminally talented young men, known as the Young Turks, including Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. After Frankie Yale's assassination in 1928, Joe the Boss reached new heights of power. Yet the total control he sought was denied him by the presence of Salvatore Maranzano, who headed a group of gangsters from the Sicilian village of Castellamarese del Golfo. Maranzano encroached on Joe the Boss's bootlegging operations, hijacking truckloads of his booze. Joe the Boss struck back, and there followed killings of Maranzano's soldiers. The Castellamarese War had begun. Joe the Boss passed a death sentence on the entire Castellamarese clan. Maranzano retaliated by asking Lucky Luciano to betray Joe the Boss by murdering him. Luciano had always refused Maranzano's requests to kill Joe the Boss. For one such refusal, Maranzano slashed his face so badly he was permanently disfigured. Lucky to escape with his life, he was given the nickname Lucky by Meyer Lansky. As Masseria's gang began suffering heavier losses, there were defections. Many of the Young Turks objected to the constant struggle for power within the Mafia. Lucky decided to kill Joe the Boss because he had easy access to him.
On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria was invited to a restaurant in Coney Island. Luciano was there together with Vito Genovese and Ciro Terranova. Terranova and Genovese did not stay long. Lucky and Masseria were left in the restaurant playing cards. Charlie Lucky went to the men's room. 4 gunmen came in and riddled Masseria to death. The 4 gunmen are Vito Genovese, Joe Donis, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel. So to end the Castellamarese War, they had to hit Masseria. So they betrayed their own boss. After that, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi. And he laid down the families and the whole network and who was going to be in charge of the families, you know.
Maranzano set up 5 crime families under him. But Maranzano knew that if he was to remain the boss of all bosses, he would have to eliminate some rivals. Top of his list, the man he had recently made his second in command, Lucky Luciano. Although both Sicilian, there was a huge gulf between Salvatore Maranzano and Lucky Luciano. To Lucky, Maranzano's old world airs were all nonsense. What had meaning for Lucky was making money, doing business. Maranzano didn't want anything to do with Jews. Lucky's closest ally was Meyer Lansky, a Jew. Lucky was tipped off and hired 5 killers. Posing as IRS men, they arrived at Maranzano's Park Avenue office. For the first time, Maranzano had no bodyguards. The killers stabbed him and pumped lead into his body. The boss of all bosses was dead.
The bosses of each family agreed to cooperate with other ethnic organized crime groups, such as Lepke Buckholder, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel.
The friendship of Meyer Lansky and Charlie Lucky Luciano in New York becomes a prototype of a very important connection for the future of organized crime. After the Italians take over organized crime in the 1930s, the classic pattern is the head of a mafia family in a given city has at his right hand a Jewish advisor. Lansky's the prototype, but there are many examples. Jake Guzik in Chicago performs these functions for Capone.
Lansky and Siegel started an organization called Murder Incorporated, sometimes known as La Kosher Nostra.
Murder Incorporated was an execution squad. It was permanently on call to be dispatched to various parts of the country for any members of the syndicate that wanted to use its services.
These people, you know, there's many people who believe that anybody could have went to Murder Incorporated and have their wife assassinated or whatever, okay, for a fee. This is totally wrong. They were only available as killers to the underworld. Any gang in the nation that had any power in the underworld could use their services. And the best part about it is, when they did the hit, they didn't have no connection with the victim at all. They would come in from another town, somebody would finger the victim, he would do the job, and hightail it out of town, and that was it.
But the Mafia wasn't all murder. Luciano saw it as a business. In 1931, he set up the Commission as a nationwide board of directors.
Luciano is known as the man who Americanized the Mafia. What's usually meant by that is that he eliminated a lot of these old superstitions and taboos and prejudices. He made it less clannish and more of an active business involved in the work of making money illegally.
The old ways and the old leaders were finally dead, and Charles Lucky Luciano was at last king. By 1933, he had transformed the Mafia into a fearsome money-making machine, a national syndicate that would one day do business equal to that of the nation's 10 largest industrial corporations combined. I'm Bill Curtis.